This morning I'll be reading from the Contemplative's Craft. It's a new book of transcribed talks from Ajahn Viradhammo. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Chapter 10. Living a Contemplative Life. Our reflective capacity. The teachers who have most inspired and encouraged me in my own spiritual training have always offered their teachings for reflection, rather than as a basis for assuming dogmatic positions. Buddhism has a well-developed doctrine, but when doctrine is merely held as an opinion, it easily becomes the source of a lot of argumentative debate that is not productive. The task of the contemplative is to take a teaching and internalize it, thereby making it alive in your own heart. You do this because you have faith in the teaching, rather than any blind belief in it. When I hear a teaching that makes sense to me, I need to learn how to apply it to my own life. This is a reflective capacity that we have as human beings. I like to differentiate between what I believe in and what I can reflect upon in a very alive way. I find this helpful because I am not always sure whether the ideas presented in Buddhism are true or not. But then there are things that I know for sure are true. For example, if you tell me that killing people is going to make me happy, I'll say no, because I know that harming people is not conducive to happiness. However, if you ask me about rebirth, I'll say, beats me. In my early days as a monk, I struggled with those areas of Buddhist doctrine whose truthfulness was difficult to prove one way or another. I thought that if I couldn't know for myself if something was true, then it mustn't be true. I came to see that attitude as quite arrogant. Then I felt that I had to believe in a teaching such as rebirth because I am a Buddhist monk after all. But that way of thinking didn't feel authentic either. Then I began to reflect, what if it was true? How would that affect me? And what would that imply about the way I live my life and how I perceive my world? That worked for me. I thought to myself, I'll take this model on as a kind of working hypothesis. That challenged my own beliefs and worldviews that weren't so well formulated at the time. I found this to be a helpful strategy to apply to those areas of the teachings I just wasn't sure about. I felt that I could take them on board because there was so much within Buddhist doctrine that I already trusted. This reflective capacity is what defines human consciousness. In Thailand, it is said that a biped isn't necessarily a human being, that it's living morally and reflecting on the way things are that qualifies you as such. This is a higher definition of Homo sapiens than we typically encounter. So to be fully human, we need to have this capacity to investigate and understand life, which involves a training of the mind and heart. When I reflect upon the Buddha's teachings, I obviously come from it from a monastic angle. That's how I learned about this tradition. I met my first Buddhist monk in Thailand in 1971, and within a couple of months I wanted to ordain. When I went to Thailand to train as a monk, I had never done a meditation retreat. I didn't even know what retreats were, much less who Ajahn Chah was. I just felt a strong pull to be in monastic life. Although we don't all have the vocation to be a monk or nun, I think that all of us gathered here today have a bit of the monk or nun in us. We all have that aspiration for a deeper meaning in life. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. As Theravada monastics, we have different lifestyle conventions and social responsibilities that we adhere to, which are collectively known as the Vinaya. These 227 rules of conduct include moral precepts, legal processes, hierarchical considerations, ways of assigning authority, guidelines for interacting with lay people, and so forth. Our monastic training has two streams of practice. The first encompasses our conventions of social etiquette, while the second centers on our stream of consciousness approach to understanding ourselves. In terms of the social, ethical way that I live, I'm defined as Ajahn Viradhammo. I have a Canadian passport, a social insurance number, a diary, my responsibilities as the abbot of Tissaro monastery. That's when we use the sense of I, the sense of my being a particular person. This sometimes gets confusing in light of the Buddhist concept of not self. Not self is going to the dentist. This doesn't make sense, so we say that I go to the dentist. In conventional reality, each of us does conceive of himself or herself as a person, which defines how we operate in the world in terms of our livelihood, morality, social responsibilities, social activism, care for the land, and so on. As bhikkhus, our monastic training with respect to how we live is quite detailed. Because we're encouraged to try to keep things as simple as possible, one of the strong suggestions that we work with is contentment with little. This is a very important perception to cultivate. Oftentimes, our culture promotes the opposite messages. More is better, supersize everything, buy the upgraded model, wear the latest fashion, etc. To incline the mind towards contentment with little is countercultural, and hence a powerful antidote to the restless consumerism of our society. So, as monks, we're encouraged to consider the basic monastic requisites of food, clothing, shelter, and medicinal care as good enough for the day. It's essential to know how to use our capacities for reflection and perception for training the mind. When I first entered the monastery as a trainee, I was not content with little. In fact, I was not content at all. 40 years ago, contentment was not one of my strong points. But if I thought that I had to be content with little, then I was finished from the get-go. Taking the ego position that I am someone who should be content is not a real training of the mind. Rather, it's a form of inner tyranny. To illustrate what I mean by this, let's imagine that I sit down and look at the food being offered to me and think, this is rubbish. Oh no, I shouldn't think like that. So instead, I try to tell myself, lay people are really kind. Thank you, thank you. But instead of actually feeling this, I'm thinking, gosh, I don't want to be here. When I think that I have to be a certain way, I've attached to an ideal that's not at all indicative of the way things are. So when I feel that I should be grateful and content with little, that's not being reflective. For me, being reflective means that as I receive my alms food, I try to be mindful not just of my physical actions, but also of my inner attitude in each and every situation. And as I'm aware of my inner attitude, I can also consider whether my mind is involved in wholesome or unwholesome thinking. If I'm feeling discontented with the food that I've been given, I can reflect on that and ask myself, how did the Buddha ask me to train? He asked me to train to be content with little. Now, I can make a choice not to pursue this feeling of discontent, which is not denying it. I'm not saying that I shouldn't feel discontented. I'm simply no longer making it the core value of my life. Instead, I'm choosing to cultivate a different core value, to be content with little. This is how we go about training in perception, which is very different from training in idealism. We're observing discontent arising, and then we're noting that discontent feels this way in the body. Then we shift our mind to a more wholesome perception. Yes, discontent may be present, but still, thank you for this food. Perhaps your discontent is so deep that you can't do anything about it. If so, then you simply have to hang in there. When I was involved in very rigorous training as a young monk in Thailand, there were times when I felt that I couldn't bear it anymore. I just wanted to jump the wall. So I'd reflect, this is the feeling of wanting to jump the wall. As I stayed with that feeling of wanting to escape, it would eventually cease, even though I hadn't run away. When Ajahn Sucitto became really frustrated with some aspect of monastic life, he'd say, I can't take another moment of this. Oh, there's another moment. This capacity we have to become fully conscious of our inner world, to awaken to the totality of the present moment, is the true basis of understanding ourselves and realizing the highest possibilities of human consciousness. For monastics, the Vinaya provides a kind of mirror with which to look at our behavior. How am I behaving around the requisites? How am I using the communal resources? How am I relating to senior and junior monks? What is my speech like? How do I admonish correctly? How do I receive admonishment? The Buddha conferred this wealth of teachings upon the monastic community because he lived within it. Lay people, however, have to extrapolate what these guidelines might mean in the context of non-monastic life. The principles remain the same, though. Consider right speech, which is addressed in the fourth of the 5 precepts. This precept states, I undertake the precept to refrain from lying, divisive gossip, swearing, and foolish speech. I undertake to train in right speech, to speak in concord with truth and beautifully. Because language is so powerful in terms of producing either beneficial or harmful effects, good communication is obviously very important. When we study the Buddha's teachings on right speech, we tend to observe our own speech more carefully. In this way, we become more deliberately conscious of how we communicate with others. And when we compare our own habits of speech to the Buddha's recommendations, we gain insight into what is skillful and what is unskillful. This gives rise to the intention to refrain from harming ourselves and others with wrong speech. We do this by developing inner boundaries and markers to help guide us in the ways we converse with others. As part of my own spiritual practice, I write down the elements of right speech, and then I really explore them until they become ingrained in my consciousness. By doing this, these teachings, which continue to echo in my mind, become an integral part of my daily life. They remind me to mindfully choose the path of least suffering, or what's known in Pali as dukkha, also translated as unsatisfactoriness or stress. As an example of how this works, I may find myself talking with someone and notice that I'm stretching the truth. This may not be totally immoral, but because I've pondered right speech as it relates to truthfulness, I can, even as I'm speaking, ask myself, why do I have to overstate the truth? What's going on in my consciousness that I now need to be untruthful in some way? Because the reflective mind is awake and aware, I see, I want this person to like me, or I want to manipulate them, or I like to exaggerate to get more attention. Then there's some understanding of my motive for embellishing the truth, and because this understanding is there, I can then choose to refrain from engaging in speech that is grounded in attitudes of selfishness or deceit. This course of action isn't easy, but it's a noble and potentially very fruitful one. Because these impulses, which are the causes of wrong speech and the suffering it engenders, are no longer being given free rein, they tend to die away. So there's less regret and confusion in the mind over having spoken untruthfully in one way or another. If we're aspiring to follow the Buddha's teachings, we try to communicate from a place of compassion and wisdom, which are the roots of right speech. Therefore, we train ourselves to act in accordance with the Buddha's basic recommendations to do good, refrain from causing harm, and purify the heart. This is not a form of idealism, but rather the hard work of right mindfulness and right effort. So far, we've been looking at the first kind of truth, which is known in Buddhism as conventional truth, in which, on a functional, social level, I'm Ajahn Viradhammo, abbot of a monastery, living within a world of responsibilities and relationships. Because these social parameters are clearly defined, it's easy for me to dedicate my life to being a monk. If my social role wasn't so well defined, or if I had a whole array of social roles to choose from, I might end up spending a lot of my time trying to get my social life in order. I think we've all seen that getting our lives totally right on the external level is impossible. So the more clearly we can define the social conventions we live by, the easier it will be for us to engage in inner reflection and find inner peace. The Buddha suggests that we try to maintain a stable lifestyle as much as possible, a simple one too. As a monk, I can't say what that is for lay people, but I think we all feel that less, not more, is a good attitude to have in modern life. Certainly having a simpler life where we don't get caught up in too much busyness or too many trivial distractions gives us more space in which to reflect. We now come to the second way that the Buddha asks us to look at life, one that doesn't reference a sense of self. This second kind of truth is called ultimate truth. And on this level of reality, we no longer think in terms of me or mine. Instead, we witness our stream of consciousness as a physical and mental phenomenon that is always changing according to the arising and passing away of myriad causes and conditions. When I say stream of consciousness, I don't just mean the rushing flow of thoughts as exemplified in the literature of James Joyce. Rather, I'm referring to stream of consciousness in the Buddhist sense. This includes all of the events in the conscious realm, sights, sounds, bodily feelings, smells, tastes, emotions, thoughts, perceptions, memories, and all other phenomena that constitute our inner world. Instead of relating to conscious experience in a personal way, we now relate to experience through the awareness of change. As we investigate this deeper level of reality, we notice that our bodies are sensitive to temperature, to pleasure and pain, and to comfort and discomfort. We also see that emotional feelings affect us both mentally and physically, and that the thinking mind responds to the presence of stress in the body. For instance, let's say that I go for a job interview, and that creates mental and physical stress both during and after the interview. This is natural. This is Dhamma, or the nature of what is, and I can observe it through the awareness of change. In effect, I can become intimate with the ever-changing nature of my experience. That's a stepping out of taking things personally, a stepping out of the storyline into a more fundamental knowing of thought as simply thought, bodily feeling as simply bodily feeling, and emotion as simply emotion. Rather than relating to these experiences as the subject or person who is experiencing them, I become more of an objective witness to their unfolding. This reflective skill of knowing what's going on in my inner world is something that needs to be developed. In the same way, when I'm talking with someone, I'm trying not only to get my idea across or to hear what they're saying, but I'm also attempting to notice what my inner world is doing in the course of the discussion. So I'm essentially living on two levels. Most of us do this from time to time, don't we? Let's imagine that you're talking with someone and you find you're getting uptight about what they're saying. Maybe they're expressing some strong opinions about politics or religion that you disagree with. So there's the discussion going on, but there's also the heartfelt reaction to it. If the inner reaction is unskillful, I can patiently watch it until it eventually ceases, rather than getting embroiled in it and being the victim of habitual reactivity. This is a skill that needs to be honed, one that we get better and better at with practice. In effect, not only am I functioning socially, but I'm also witnessing the way things are in the stream of consciousness in my inner world. Hence, when we refer to awareness and not self, as in feelings are not self, we're referring to this impersonal or witnessing level of experience. But as I mentioned, when we're talking about social responsibility, we're back to the self-referencing. For example, if my fellow bhikkhus find me acting inappropriately and causing harm to others, it would be ridiculous for me to say, "This behavior is not self." Instead, I need to be responsible for my conduct and try to live according to the principles of morality and generosity that the monastic code requires of me. So the social level of reality also matters, which is why we want to get that as neat or as right as possible. But as important as it is for us to function well as individuals within social parameters, if we only have that part of the equation, then we'll never realize the peace that comes with knowing that all things that arise pass away. On the other hand, if we ignore the fact that we're individuals with social and moral responsibilities, then that will confuse us so much that we won't have the capacity for reflection. Therefore, part of the method of Buddhism is right living to the best of our abilities. To have a flawless outer life, however, is impossible because our experiences are dependent on so many variables. As we gain more understanding of how our consciousness works and what is and isn't conducive to peace, we can start to develop the right language with which to train ourselves. For instance, when I'm meditating, I'll often silently repeat to myself the word non-anticipation. This helps me to become aware of any sense of anticipation that may be arising in the mind. Almost all meditators experience the desire to try to get some result because that's how we're conditioned to see effort. If I make an effort to do something, I expect to get something out of it. I'm not doing this for nothing. But if I'm able to patiently stay aware of the feeling of anticipation, knowing it will change, then the anticipation changes to non-anticipation. So the use of the word non-anticipation can help me to notice my tendency to reach forward to the next moment during meditation. This is quite useful, since I'm now in the position to choose to notice the changing nature of anticipation, rather than attaching to that feeling through a lack of awareness. As a young monk, I came to see how the wise use of language was also a form of right thought. In other words, it came about as a direct result of understanding the way things are. When I first started to meditate, I was an extremely willful and testosterone-driven monk with a very gaining mind. I thought I was going to get enlightened tomorrow. Although this kind of ignorance was well-intentioned, it was still wrong understanding. After suffering through an enormous amount of willful effort, with various teachers telling me to take it easy, I finally began to reflect on what right effort was. I began to contemplate, well, that doesn't work, that's for sure. So what does work? That was the beginning of right understanding for me. If we can maintain an attitude of inner vigilance, observing and reflecting on our suffering and the errors we make in our practice, then our choices in life become more in tune with the Dhamma. As a result of this, the suffering that we create through ignorance fades away. This kind of training is very pragmatic. It allows me to see that when I try too hard, I get a bad result. What would produce a good result then? So I tell myself, be gentler, kinder to yourself. Take it easy. Be more patient. That language is coming from insight, thus from right understanding. You get right thought, right suggestion, and right aspiration. I think I'll leave it there.
Andamayang Dhammacakaya Sadhukaram Dadamase.
Sadhu, 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 anumodam.
Comments or questions? Certainly, Lumpur Viradhammo has been through the gauntlet in his monastic life. Living in community had all the difficulties you could imagine. So he's a good one to reflect on those things.
I think it's also interesting that he is quite unique in spending 10 or 11 years looking after his mother and living in, as a monk, but more in a lay kind of context, which I think helps him very much in the way he teaches and applies teachings for lay people.
Yeah, he looked after his mother for a number of years.
10.
He said it was Brahma Viharas, his main practice during that time.
Would you say that overview what through the gauntlet, like in terms of communal practice? Is there anything that you could share, anything specific that he shared in talks and stuff?
I don't want to say too much because I might misrepresent him, but what he's shared is like when they tried to make him the abbot of Amaravati, and it was a period of time when, there was that first generation of Chithurst Amaravati were becoming more senior. They were all 8, 9, 10, 11 vasas, and then apparently a number of them disrobed, and a lot of them blamed it on him. It was his fault. So, and it was quite heavy, quite a heavy time. And he didn't like giving talks or teaching. He would get very nervous before giving talks, and very self-conscious. And so it was a very rough time for him.
Was this around when Longport Shaw passed away?
After.
So it was a different sort of mass disrobing time. Because there was, right, when Longport Shaw passed away, greater disrobings.
This was another mass disrobing, yeah. This is another sort of group.
This is picking it up from the beginning of the talk, or the reading, but I find it kind of interesting how we feel like we have to, or sort of in this culture we feel like we have to be so apologetic about the belief in rebirth as sort of this kind of woo-woo new age thing, but I think it's really useful to see that the criteria for scientific method and objectivity is you have I think we accept that there's a lot of things in the world which we don't understand or haven't seen for ourselves, a virus or an actual plant or something, but we accept that there's certain experts with specific knowledge and tools, and because these experts are confirming a common phenomenon independently of each other, then we consider that scientifically objective. And I think a really similar thing applies in here. You have across cultures and across 2,500 years, consistently people who develop samadhi, and I think this is one of the issues is in the West we don't really have an understanding of what that means, but who develop the mind in a certain way, all independently confirm existence after death. And a lot of commonalities in how they talk about it as well. So, I really think that meets the criteria for scientific method, and that's not even going into the research of, there's Professor Ian Stevenson in University of Virginia, and the whole faculty there over 40 years collected the past life memories and cases of thousands of kids and confirmed them against past facts that the kids had no way of knowing, and were followed around by reporters, were peer-reviewed. There's a huge body of evidence, and that's not just speaking to the sort of experience which people in our lives tend to have around these things, which are really inexplicable. But I just find it interesting how, because the current scientific viewpoint doesn't accept these things, how they somehow get sort of dismissed as unscientific, but actually there's a good deal of evidence there. And I just remember when I held those views, I sort of would hear that and just dismiss it outright, and it wouldn't even make a dent until I really consciously put aside that disbelief. It was all right, I'm actually going to look into this and actually investigate. So it's a minor point in the reading, but I do think it's interesting how apologetic we feel like we have to be about these really essential elements of right view, when I think actually they are scientifically supported in a quite powerful way.
Yeah, I've said this so many times, we can't see viruses and bacteria, but we believe in them completely, that they're real. But then we might think, oh, somebody's being superstitious if they believe in ghosts, but it's just as valid as far as there's an expert who says viruses exist, and there's also experts who say ghosts exist, experts in that area where they can see them. So why do we believe one and not the other? It's like, as long as an expert says so, in a scientific culture, if an expert says so, then we believe it. It's like I might say something about medicine or something, but and it might not be so believable, but then an expert might come along and say the same thing, but then we'll believe the expert because they're an expert. So it's quite interesting, this whole world of experts and professionals and credentials.
I think it's also interesting how, even though an expert can say something about the results of our actions, results of certain habits like drugs or whatever, it doesn't matter what they say, that people are just going to do bad things anyway without caring.
Yeah, you can choose if you want to do what's going to cause suffering or what's going to cause happiness. This is like experts in suffering. Yeah, like เรื่องอดีตชาติปกติฝรั่งไม่ค่อยเชื่อครับต้องเชื่อหรือเปล่าที่จะปฏิบัติได้ครับ
เหมือนพระอาจารย์บอกว่าเคยทำป้านนทำดูใบไม้ดูต้นไม้ในป่ามันเยอะแค่ไหนแล้วก็ใบไม้แล้วก็หยิบใบไม้ขึ้นมากำมือเอาใบไม้ในกำมือกับในป่าเนี่ยเยอะกว่ากันก็เป็นไม้ในป่าเยอะกว่าแล้วพระอาจารย์บอกว่าเยอะเรื่องที่เราจำเป็นที่ต้องจะศึกษาเนี่ยคือท่านว่าให้ศึกษาเรื่องทุกข์ใช่ไหมหรือมันจะมีเยอะแต่ก็ไม่จำเป็นที่เราต้องไปศึกษาหมดเราไม่จำเป็นศึกษาเฉพาะเรื่องทุกข์เหตุให้เกิดทุกข์ทางเราทุกข์
So I asked Ajahn Sake, like, is it necessary really to believe in past lives? Normally Westerners don't really, or might have a hard time believing in that. Is that necessary for practice? And then he said, he talked about the handful of leaves. The Buddha's with Ananda in the forest, and says, Ananda, what is more, the leaves on the forest floor, or the leaves? He picks up some leaves in his hand, or the leaves in his hand. Of course, the leaves on the forest floor. And then said, well, what I've realized for myself, in terms of seeing all my past lives and so on, it's like the leaves on the forest floor, but leaves in my hand is what is relevant. So if you can't see something for yourself, it's not necessary that you have to believe it or not, but the leaves in my hand is knowing what you can know and see directly currently is that there is suffering, there is a cause of suffering, there is a cessation of suffering, there's the path leading to the cessation of suffering, so the Four Noble Truths, so that's what you can see directly, so that's really all that's necessary for practice, and then everything else is just extra.
ถ้าเราศึกษาและปฏิบัติไปเรื่อยๆความสงสัยอะไรต่างๆมันจะค่อยลดลงไป แต่เมื่อเรากำลังศึกษาอยู่ความสงสัยลังเลมันก็จะมาขัดขวางในการปฏิบัติของเราแต่เราเชื่อมั่นและศรัทธาในคำสั่งสอนของพ่อแม่ครูบาอาจารย์และพระพุทธเจ้าของเราเนี่ยมันจะค่อยๆคลี่คลายแล้วก็จะเห็นในใจเราแล้ว เพราะธรรมะมันจะให้กันไม่ได้มันจะปฏิบัติมันจะเกิดขึ้นในความรู้สึกของเราจะบุญมีไหมบาปมีไหมมันจะเกิดขึ้นในใจของเราที่เรามาปฏิบัติกันเนี่ยก็เพื่อจะมาเห็นในสัจธรรมเห็นความจริงนี่แหละเราก็ปฏิบัติไปเรื่อยๆเรื่อยๆมันก็จะค่อยคลี่คลายและความลังเลสงสัยมันจะค่อยลดลงแต่เรายังกำลังสติปัญญาเราไม่พอมันก็สงสัยไปเรื่อยครับสงสัยไม่เฉพาะเรื่องตายแล้วเกิดโลกสวรรค์บุญบาปมันก็สงสัยไปหมดแล้วครับเพราะมันยังไม่เป็นสัมมาทิฏฐิ
So like, as we practice, things start to become a bit more clear. Whatever we doubt, whatever our mind is wavering. Kli-klai, is that like, what is that?
Relax, spread out.
Become familiar with, or can it be like become familiar with, or?
Maybe, I think it means more.
Oh, like doubts are being allayed.
Be clear.
Oh, okay. And gradually these things become more clear, and our vacillation and our wavering in terms of these things. If we have a doubt, we can, as time goes on, as we practice and study ourselves, then these things can become more apparent and clear, and the doubts can be slowly put to rest. So like mundane right view is like there is birth, there is death, there is merit, there is demerit, there's good and bad. But as we practice, then the heart just knows for itself when it starts to see the results of all these things.